The desert wind carried the smell of sage and ash across the empty ridges. Jonah Mercer had lived alone in those hills for more than a decade, long enough that most in town thought he had gone half mad. He kept to his cabin, a shotgun always leaning by the door, and let the years bleed one into the other. War had taken more than comrades from him. It had carved out his hope, left only silence and scars too deep to show. That afternoon, he was working the fence line when he saw movement by the tree line. At first, he thought it was a coyote limping through the brush, but then the figure stumbled forward into the clearing. A young woman, barefoot, skin scraped raw, a torn scrap of linen wrapped tight around her, like she had fought to keep even that much. She collapsed just beyond the posts he had hammered into the ground, dust rising in a soft cloud around her. Jonah dropped the hammer and hurried over. She tried to push herself up, but her arms gave out. Her voice was barely a whisper, dry as gravel. "Please, don't." He froze, kneeling beside her. Her eyes were wide, not pleading for food or water, but for something else, safety space. Anything but more hands grabbing at her. He eased off, speaking low. "I won't hurt you." She trembled, clutching the cloth tighter to her chest. When it slipped just slightly, Jonah caught a glimpse of her back and felt his stomach twist. Scars ran across her skin, not just from whips or fire, but carved shapes, letters burned deep into flesh. Someone had branded her like cattle, turned her body into a canvas of cruelty. For a moment, he could not breathe. His mind dragged him back to Tennessee, to the girl he had failed to protect in the war, the one with eyes just like this. He had walked away then, and he had sworn never again. He shrugged off his coat, moving slow, deliberate. "Take this," he murmured. She flinched but did not resist as he draped it over her shoulders, covering the shame someone else had forced on her. When her trembling eased just a fraction, he gathered her, gently lifting her as though she weighed nothing, and carried her to the cabin. Inside, he laid her on the old cot by the wall. She curled into the coat, clutching it like it was made of steel. Jonah busied himself with the stove, building a fire, not because the night was cold, but because its crackle filled the silence with a kind of heartbeat. He brewed coffee, the bitter smell settling into the room. She did not speak, only flinched at every creak outside her eyes, darting to the door as though expecting men to burst through. Jonah did not press her. He knew words could wound as deep as knives. Instead, he sat at the table watching the fire, his rough hands wrapped around the chipped mug. Every now and then, he glanced toward her, making sure she still breathed, still clung to the coat. Hours passed. When the moon rose, pale and cold, she stirred. Her head turned just enough for her eyes to find his. No words, no gratitude, only a look that said, "I am still here." Jonah nodded once, the way soldiers do in trenches when words are useless, and she turned back to the wall. At dawn, she whispered her first request, water. He filled a tin cup and held it steady. Her hands shook so badly that he guided it to her lips. She drank greedily, drops running down her chin, then sank back into the pillow. When her eyes lingered on him a moment longer than before, Jonah felt something shift inside him. It was not thanks, not yet, but it was not fear either. It was the faintest sign of life clawing back through the ruins. Jonah knew better than to ask who she was or what had been done to her. Those answers would come if she chose to give them. For now what mattered was this: she had crossed his land. She was broken but breathing, and by every bone in his body, he would see that no one broke her again. That night, as he cleaned his shotgun by the light of the fire, he thought of how many like her might be out there, running through the hills, hunted by men who carved their power into flesh. He glanced at the cot where she slept fitfully, clutching his coat, and made a silent promise. Whatever storm had driven her to his door, it would not take her back. The morning light slid across the floorboards in pale ribbons. Jonah had dozed in his chair, shotgun leaning against his knee. The fire burned down to glowing embers. He woke at the sound of fabric rustling. The girl was sitting up, clutching his coat around her shoulders, her hair tangled and wild. She looked younger in the daylight, though the scars on her back told a story older than her years. Jonah moved slowly, careful not to spook her. "Coffee's on the stove," he said in a voice low and steady. "It's bitter as hell, but it'll warm you." She hesitated, then nodded. He poured some into a tin cup and set it on the small table near her cot before stepping back. She reached with trembling hands, sipping cautiously. The warmth brought a faint color to her cheeks. After a long silence, she whispered, "Ellie." Jonah tilted his head. Your name." She nodded, eyes down. It was the first gift of trust she had offered, and he accepted it without pressing further. The day passed in quiet routine. Jonah split wood behind the cabin while Ellie sat on the porch steps, still wrapped in his coat. She didn't speak much, but she watched him work, eyes flicking to the tree line as though expecting danger at any moment. Every sound in the brush made her flinch. Every gust of wind rattling the shutters drew her gaze. By evening, Jonah cooked beans and cornbread, setting a plate before her. She ate slowly, like each bite was both a comfort and a burden. Halfway through, she set down her fork and spoke in a hollow voice. "They used to make me clean their boots." Jonah's hands stilled, but he didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on his plate, giving her space. Ellie's voice trembled but kept going. "There's a camp, not on any map. Men run it. They dig silver, make others dig too. If you fall, they beat you. If you try to leave—" She trailed off, her hand tightening on the coat. "The first time I ran, they broke my nose. The second time, they carved my back." The words hung heavy in the air. Jonah felt anger burn in his chest, but he swallowed it. Showing rage would only remind her of the men she fled. Instead, he said quietly, "And the third time." Her eyes flicked to his, wary, then softened when she saw no judgment there. "I didn't plan it. A guard was drunk, the gate loose. I ran until I couldn't breathe. I thought I'd die out there." Jonah leaned back, nodding once. "But you didn't." She gave a humorless laugh. "Not yet." As the sun sank, hoofbeats echoed faint on the ridge. Jonah stiffened, hand sliding to a shotgun. Ellie froze, eyes wide, body curling in on itself. He stepped onto the porch, scanning the horizon. A single rider approached, his vest too fine for a rancher. His mustache waxed but greasy. The kind of man who wore cruelty like perfume. He reined up at the yard, smirking when his eyes landed on the porch. "Ellie Rose," he called. "You've got one chance to come quiet." Ellie gasped, shrinking back into the doorway. Jonah stepped down from the porch, shotgun cradled in his arms, but not aimed yet. "She's not going anywhere," he said flatly. The man sneered. "Ain't up to you, old-timer." Jonah cocked the shotgun, the sound sharp as thunder in the still air. "Then you don't know me." For a long moment, the man considered. His grin faded just enough to show he understood the risk. He spat into the dirt, tugged his reins, and turned his horse. But as he rode off, he glanced back with eyes full of promise, dark, patient, vengeful. Ellie's breath came ragged when Jonah stepped back inside. She pressed herself against the wall, shaking. "He'll be back. He'll bring others." Jonah set the shotgun on the table, his face carved from stone. "Then we'll be ready." That night, the cabin was filled with a silence different from before. Not the heavy silence of grief, but the tense quiet of waiting for a storm. Ellie sat by the fire, knees drawn to her chest, watching Jonah clean the shotgun with methodical care. She studied the set of his jaw, the steady rhythm of his hands, and for the first time since she had stumbled from the woods, she felt a fragile thread of safety. When she finally lay down, she whispered into the dark, almost too soft to hear, "Thank you." Jonah paused, looking toward her cot. She was already drifting into uneasy sleep, but he heard the words and they burned into him like a brand, proof that even in a world scarred by cruelty, gratitude and hope still had breath left. He sat awake long into the night, staring at the fire shotgun across his knees, and made another vow. Whatever devils came for Ellie Rose, they would have to come through him first. The dawn was brittle, the kind of stillness that made even birds hold their tongues. Jonah stood outside the cabin, eyes sweeping the ridge lines. Ellie was inside, still curled beneath his coat, though he doubted she had slept more than an hour. Every time the wind rattled the shutters, he'd heard her stir. He went about his chores quietly, fetching water from the creek, feeding the chickens, checking the fence. Yet his every movement was half a disguise. His ears strained for hoofbeats, his eyes tracked every shadow across the hills. The rider from yesterday had left more than dust behind. He'd left a promise, and Jonah knew men like him always kept their promises. By midday, Ellie stepped out of the cabin, pale but upright. Her bare feet touched the packed earth of the yard, and she squinted against the sun. "Shouldn't I leave?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "They're looking for me, not you." Jonah leaned on the axe handle, wiping sweat from his brow. "Running again won't stop them. Men like that, they chase because they think they own what they marked. Best way to stop a hound is to face it." Ellie shivered. "And if we lose?" His eyes, storm gray and steady, met hers. "Then we don't." The rest of the day passed under a veil of tension. Jonah sharpened his knives, checked the shotgun, and laid out extra shells in neat rows along the windowsill. Ellie helped in small ways, filling water buckets, gathering kindling, straightening the table as if order itself could ward off chaos. They spoke little, but every glance between them carried the same truth: tonight or tomorrow the storm would break. Just as the sun dipped behind the pines, the sound came: hoofbeats, not one, but several. Ellie froze on the porch steps, her hands clutching the railing. Jonah stepped beside her, shotgun already in hand. Dust rose on the ridge road, and three riders appeared, dark against the bleeding sky. They rode like they owned the land, slow and deliberate. The man from before led them, his greasy mustache catching the last light. Beside him rode two others, one broad-shouldered with a scar across his temple, the other thin and twitchy, hand never far from his belt. They drew up at the yard, horses stamping and snorting. The leader grinned wide. "Told you I'd be back. Now step aside, old man." Jonah's voice was calm even. "You're not taking her." The broad one spat. "You think you can stop us with one gun?" Jonah raised the shotgun, not yet firing but steady. "I've stopped worse." The leader chuckled low. "Careful. If you shoot one, the other two will carve you up before you can blink. And the girl, well, she'll wish she never ran." Ellie's breath came sharp, but Jonah didn't move. Silence stretched thin as a wire. The twitchy one shifted in his saddle fingers, brushing his pistol. That was enough. Jonah fired the blast, thunderous smoke clouding the porch. The twitchy man cried out, toppling from his horse, clutching a bleeding leg. The other two froze, eyes wide, horses prancing nervously. Before another word could be spoken, a new voice carried from the tree line. "I'd think real hard about your next move, boys." A figure stepped out from the shadows, tall, broad, a badge glinting on his chest rifle, resting easy in his hands. Abram Hale. Jonah felt a jolt of recognition, memories of war trenches and nights filled with gunfire. Abram, the one man he had once trusted with his life, now sheriff of the territory. The leader's grin faltered. "This ain't your business, Sheriff." Abram's eyes, hard as flint, locked on him. "Anything that happens in my territory is my business. And that girl, she's under my protection now." The broad-shouldered man shifted uneasily. The leader cursed under his breath, then tugged his reins. "This ain't over." "No," Abram said evenly, "but it is for tonight." They wheeled their horses, dragging their wounded companion between them. Dust swallowed them as they retreated down the ridge. Silence followed, heavy but relieved. Jonah lowered the shotgun slowly, his arms stiff. Ellie sagged against the railing, trembling but still standing. Abram approached, his eyes never leaving Jonah. "Figured your note meant trouble," he said. "You always did write like gunpowder and regret." For the first time in years, Jonah felt a laugh stir in his chest, though it came out rough and short. "Good to see you, old friend." Abram nodded toward Ellie. "She's safe for now. But those men, they'll crawl back out of the dark sooner or later. You ready for that?" Jonah glanced at Ellie, her face pale but her eyes steady. He thought of the scars carved into her back, of the way she had whispered thank you, of the promise he had made in silence. "Yeah," he said, voice low, "but sure, I'm ready." That night, as the fire burned low and Abram kept watch outside, Ellie sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. She looked across at Jonah, her voice quiet but clear. "You didn't have to risk yourself for me." Jonah met her gaze. "Maybe not, but I wasn't about to let them take you back." Her lips trembled, then steadied. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he said. "I know you deserve more than what they tried to carve into you." For the first time, she let herself believe him. And for Jonah, it was the first time in years he felt like living meant more than just surviving. The morning came too still. Not the peaceful kind of still, but the kind that pressed against the ears, warning that something waited just beyond sight. Jonah rose before dawn, stepping outside with his shotgun cradled in one arm. Ellie followed barefoot in the dirt, his coat still draped across her shoulders. She scanned the tree line with wary eyes. "They're out there," she whispered. He nodded once. "Yeah, they're waiting for us to forget." They didn't forget. All day they worked side by side preparing. Jonah stacked barrels of water inside the cabin, checked the shutters he had reinforced, and laid extra shells across the table in neat lines. Ellie carried wood-fetch buckets and gathered every sharp tool she could find. Her hands shook sometimes, but she never stopped moving. By dusk, the waiting ended. Hoofbeats thundered on the ridge louder than before. More than 3 this time. Ellie's breath hitched, but she squared her shoulders. Jonah guided her inside, bolting the door, then took his place at the window slit he'd cut in the planks. Shadows appeared against the fading light, 6 riders this time, circling like wolves around a pen. The leader, greasy mustache gleaming, called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Old man, you've made a mistake keeping what's ours. Step aside and maybe we'll let you keep breathing." Jonah's reply was steady. "She's not yours. Never was." Laughter rolled across the yard, cruel and sharp. "You think you can stand against 6? I've stood against worse." The first shot cracked the air. A bullet punched splinters from the cabin wall. Ellie flinched but didn't cry out. Jonah returned fire, the boom of the shotgun rattling the rafters. One rider's horse screamed, rearing, throwing its rider into the dirt. Chaos erupted, guns barking, hooves pounding, shouts tearing through the night. Ellie crouched near the table, clutching a knife Jonah had pressed into her hand. Her heart pounded so loud she thought it might drown out the gunfire. But when she saw a shadow slip near the back window, instinct took over. She lunged, slamming the shutter down just as a hand tried to pry it open. The man cursed, pulling back, and Ellie drove the blade through the gap, catching flesh. A scream split the night, and the shadow vanished. Jonah's eyes flicked to her pride, flashing in his storm-gray gaze. "Good," he said gruffly, then fired again, dropping another rider from his saddle. The fight raged on, smoke filling the cabin, bullets thudding into the walls. One slug grazed Jonah's arm, tearing through his sleeve. He gritted his teeth but kept firing, reloading with practiced calm. Ellie tore strips from a blanket, pressing them to his wound between volleys. Outside, the leader bellowed orders, rallying the men. "Burn them out." Torches flared in the dark flames, licking high. Jonah's gut clenched. If fire caught the cabin, they'd be done. He glanced at Ellie, her face pale but determined. "We can't let them light it," he said. "Stay low. Follow me when I move." Before she could answer, he kicked the door open and charged into the yard, shotgun booming. Ellie followed, clutching the knife, her bare feet striking dirt and ash. Together they drove toward the men with torches. Jonah dropped one with a shot to the chest. Ellie, fueled by something fiercer than fear, hurled herself at another, slashing his arm and knocking the torch from his grasp. Fire sputtered out in the dirt. The yard became a maelstrom, smoke, firelight, gunfire. Jonah fought like a man who had nothing left to lose, his every move, precise, brutal, unstoppable. Ellie fought like someone who had lost too much already and refused to lose again. When the dust began to clear, only 2 riders remained mounted. The leader glared at them, rage twisting his face. "This isn't finished," he snarled. Before Jonah could reply, another voice cut through the chaos. "Yes, it is." Abram Hale rode in from the ridge, rifle steady, a posse of armed townsmen behind him. The bandits froze, outnumbered, outgunned. The leader spat into the dirt but wheeled his horse, retreating into the night with the last of his men. The rest lay scattered, wounded, dead, or bound by the posse. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of burning torches dying in the dirt. Jonah lowered his shotgun, his chest heaving. Ellie stood beside him, knife still in hand, hair wild, eyes blazing. Abram dismounted, his gaze sweeping the yard. "Hell of a stand you made here." Jonah wiped blood from his sleeve. Wasn't about choice. Abram's eyes softened as they fell on Ellie. "You held your ground." She nodded once, too spent for words, but in her eyes was a fire that hadn't been there before. Later, after the bodies were hauled away and the posse rode back to town, the cabin settled into uneasy quiet. Jonah sat at the table, cleaning his shotgun while Ellie bandaged his arm properly. Her hands were steadier now, her face calmer. "I thought I'd die out there," she said softly. Jonah looked at her, storm-gray eyes steady. "You lived. That's what matters." Her lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "We lived." Jonah nodded, the weight of the words sinking deep. For the first time in 12 years, he felt something stir in the ashes of his soul. Not just survival, not just memory. Something alive, fragile, but real. Hope. The days after the battle carried a strange weight, like the air after a storm, quiet, heavy, still unsettled. The bodies had been taken away, the blood washed from the yard by rain that came the next morning, yet the echoes of gunfire lingered in the walls and in their bones. Jonah moved stiffly, his bandaged arm throbbing when he tried to chop wood or lift buckets. Ellie often stopped him with a glance sharp as any command. "Sit," she'd say, and he would not out of weakness, but out of something else, something he couldn't name. She busied herself with the cabin. She swept the porch each morning, gathered herbs from the hillside, mended Jonah's torn shirts, with stitches rough but earnest. The marks of her suffering were still etched deep in her body, but a new light began to glimmer in her eyes. One evening she even laughed, a small, brittle laugh, but real, when a chicken escaped the coop and chased Jonah across the yard before he caught it. He froze at the sound, stunned, then found himself smiling, the corners of his mouth unfamiliar with the motion. Yet nights were harder. Jonah woke more than once to muffled cries from the cot, Ellie thrashing in tangled blankets. He never touched her, never startled her awake. Instead, he stoked the fire higher, letting the crackle fill the room until her breathing eased. Sometimes when dawn came, she'd sit at the table with dark eyes and whisper, "They're still there in my head." Jonah understood. He had his own ghost faces from Tennessee, from the war men and women he couldn't save. One night when her trembling would not stop, he told her about one of them. There was a girl, he said quietly, staring into the flames. Name was Mary. I promised her family I'd get her out when the fires came. I failed. Been carrying that weight ever since. Ellie turned toward him, surprised by the confession. You never forgot her? No, Jonah said, his voice like gravel. But remembering doesn't mean the dead should bury the living. The words seemed to settle something in Ellie. She touched the locket she always kept near her chest and whispered, maybe remembering is how we keep going. Their days fell into rhythm again. Jonah's arm healed slowly, and as his strength returned, he taught Ellie small things: how to handle the rifle, how to spot tracks in the dirt, how to tell when the wind carried danger. She learned quickly, stubbornly, each lesson carved from her desire never to be helpless again. One afternoon as they practiced near the creek, Jonah corrected her grip on the rifle. His rough hands brushed hers, steadying her aim. She didn't flinch this time. Instead, she held his gaze, her breath uneven. Why are you helping me? She asked. Jonah hesitated. He could have said it was duty or habit or simple survival, but the truth pressed harder. Because you deserve a chance to live, not just to run. For a moment, neither moved, the rifle heavy between them, the sound of water rushing past their feet. Then Ellie lowered the weapon and looked away, but the heat in her cheeks betrayed her. The next day, Abram rode back, dust on his coat, his eyes sharp. He brought news the mining camp was stirring, its masters furious at losing what they considered property. They'll try again, he warned, and next time they'll bring more than half a dozen. Ellie's face paled, but her jaw set firm. Then we fight again. Abram studied her, then glanced at Jonah. She's got fire, but fire alone won't hold them. We'll be ready, Jonah said. That evening, after Abram left, Ellie sat by the window, staring at the horizon where the sun bled into the hills. I don't want to run anymore, she said softly, but I don't want to bring ruin to you either. Jonah leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Ruin already came for me years ago. What's here now? It feels like something worth standing for. Her eyes glistened. And if standing means dying? He stepped closer, his voice low but certain. Then I'd rather die for something than keep living for nothing. Silence stretched thick with words unspoken. Ellie reached across the table, her fingers brushing his scarred knuckles. It was the first time she touched him without fear. Jonah didn't pull away. The night settled heavy around the cabin, coyotes howling in the distance. Yet inside there was warmth, fragile, trembling, but real. Ellie laid her head on the table, exhaustion pulling her down. Jonah sat beside her, watching the firelight dance across her hair. For the first time in 12 years, he felt the ache in his chest ease, if only a little. Hope had begun to grow roots in this barren ground. The final storm came with no warning, just the sudden cry of crows scattering from the ridge and the distant thunder of hooves. Jonah had been stacking firewood when the sound reached him, low, at first, then swelling like a flood. Ellie ran from the cabin, rifle clutched awkwardly but firmly in her hands, her braid flying loose behind her. They're here, she said, her voice tight but steady. Jonah's eyes scanned the horizon. Dust rose in the distance, more riders than before, at least a dozen. They fanned out as they approached a line of shadows carrying fire and steel. Jonah felt his gut tighten, but his voice was calm when he spoke. Get inside. We'll hold them from there. They barred the doors, checked the shutters, laid out shells and knives. Jonah loaded the shotgun, the weight familiar grounding. Ellie stood beside him, her fingers white-knuckled around the rifle stock. The leader's voice carried across the yard, cruel and certain. Old man, this is your last chance. Give her up and we'll let you live. Jonah answered through the shutter. You'll leave empty-handed. Laughter rolled from outside, then the order came. Gunfire erupted, bullets tearing into the walls. Wood splintered, glass shattered. Ellie flinched but didn't drop her weapon. Jonah fired through the slit, dropping a rider clean from his saddle. Chaos followed, men shouting, horses screaming, smoke filling the air. One of the bandits made it to the porch, kicking at the door. The wood buckled but held. Jonah nodded toward Ellie. Window. She swallowed hard, then braced herself and fired. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, nearly knocking her back. But the shot was true. The man staggered, falling from the porch steps. Ellie gasped at what she'd done, but Jonah's voice steadied her. Good. Keep breathing. Keep aiming. Torches flew through the air, landing against the walls. Flames licked at the dry wood. Jonah cursed, rushing to stamp them out. Ellie covered him, firing when another rider tried to charge close. The recoil bruised her shoulder, but she didn't falter. Just when it seemed the cabin would be overrun, another volley of gunfire cracked from the ridge. The bandits shouted in alarm as figures rode in hard, Abram Hale at the front rifle, blazing a half-dozen townsmen at his back. Dust and smoke churned as the posse collided with the attackers' bullets, trading at close range. Jonah seized the moment, throwing the door open and stepping into the yard. Ellie followed, heart hammering but resolve set. Together they fought beside Abram's men, the yard a maelstrom of dirt, fire, and steel. Jonah's shotgun roared again and again, each blast dropping another threat. Ellie moved like a shadow at his side, striking when she had, to her fear burning into something sharper, fury, defiance, the will to live. The leader rode through the chaos, eyes fixed on her, his pistol raised. You're mine, he snarled. Jonah turned, but the leader fired first. The shot grazed Jonah's ribs, spinning him back. Ellie screamed, the sound raw, and leveled her rifle. She fired before she could think. The leader's eyes went wide, shock flashing across his face before he tumbled from his horse, lifeless in the dirt. The fight collapsed after that. The remaining riders fled into the trees, chased by Abram's posse. Silence fell heavy over the yard, broken only by Jonah's ragged breathing and the crackle of dying flames. Ellie dropped the rifle and rushed to him, her hands pressing against his side, where blood seeped through his shirt. Stay with me, she begged, her voice shaking. Jonah gritted his teeth, forcing a grim smile. Takes more than a bullet to put me down. Abram knelt beside them, checking the wound. It's clean. He'll live. Ellie sagged in relief, tears streaking her face. She pressed her forehead to Jonah's, whispering, We lived. Days later, the cabin bore scars of battle, but still stood. Jonah healed slowly, his movements stiff but steady. Ellie never left his side, tending the wound, cooking meals, sweeping the porch as if reclaiming it from the shadows. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the hills, Jonah sat on the porch, Ellie beside him. Silence stretched between them, not heavy but warm. Finally, she spoke. I don't want to keep running. I want to build something. Here. Jonah looked at her, his storm gray eyes softer than she'd ever seen. You sure? She nodded. This place, it feels like home. For a long moment, he said nothing, only watching the horizon. Then he reached for her hand, rough fingers closing gently around hers. Then we build it, together. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying away the last of the smoke and blood. In its place was something new, fragile, uncertain, but alive. Jonah had thought his story ended years ago, buried under silence and regret. Ellie had thought hers was over before it began. But here in the battered cabin on the ridge, they had found a beginning. And as the stars rose over the desert, their hearts beat steady with a truth stronger than scars or storms. They were no longer just surviving, they were living.